according to a new Gallup poll, 89% of those polled considered the presidential candidate's position on the economy extremely or very important to their vote. Trailing the economy on issues most likely to influence voters at the polls are education, healthcare, and national security.
Editor-in-chief at Gallup, Mohamed Younis, joins us now to discuss how the poll's findings could influence voters next month. He's also going to share Gallup's new findings on voter enthusiasm. Welcome back, Mohamed. Great to see you.
Good to see you, Mohamed.
Always great to be back. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Take us through some of your polling on what issues voters are really focused on and how these numbers have changed over the course of the year.
Absolutely. Right now, as with most elections at this point, the economy is the number one issue. At least registered voters in our polls say are extremely or very important for their decision in terms of who they're going to choose for president. Terrorism comes in at second, and it's sort of a negative. So people are obviously concerned, but it's not a current issue, but it still rates really high. Healthcare and response to the virus are right there under it. President Trump right now, his approval on the virus has been very similar to his presidential approval rating. So national figures have not done very well. Nancy Pelosi, the Congress, et cetera, do a lot worse than state health officials and national health officials like Dr. Fauci and others. Relations with China, relations with Russia coming in way at the bottom of the list. Obviously, extremely important issues, not only just on their own right, but even in terms of election influence. But I think the most concerning to me is concern over voter fraud, which we've seen a massive swing since 2007. The last time we asked, basically, the question is, are you concerned, or do you think it'll be a major or minor problem for people to use fraudulent means to cast their votes in the presidential election? Yeah. In 2007, 26% of Americans said it would be a major problem. This month, or just in September, that number has shot up now to 53% of Americans. So now only 25% of Americans expect it to be a minor problem. 53% expect it to be a major problem, which is something we will continue to watch really closely on election night and how this pans out.
Yeah, certainly. Mohamed, can you break down the partisan differences of prioritization amongst voters? I think that might be some of the most fascinating stuff that you guys have found.
Absolutely. I mean, the race relations has really been a number one difference this year. It's been a national focus that we haven't seen for decades. But among Republicans, certainly the economy is important, but you see COVID up there really high. It's important to note that a lot of these numbers could dramatically change yet in the next week or two, based on everything that's just happened over the weekend with President Trump and his visit to Walter Reed, and now all of the dynamics around whether it was the right move, the wrong move. But COVID continues to be the number one thing Democrats are focused on after the economy. For Republicans, obviously, they have a different take on that. We've seen that partisan divide over and over. But, it's important to keep in mind, Sagar, that a lot of people have already made up their minds in terms of Democrats and Democrat leaners or Republican leaners. Mm-hmm. At this point in the game, you would not expect too many people who identify with one party or the other to really change their minds too much. We've had a lot of October surprises early and far between. It's interesting that 57% of Americans at this point think that a third party is needed in the country. Obviously, the partisans are tend to be most pleased with the Democrat and Republican Party as they are today. But a majority of Americans still think there's room for a third party. When we ask about people giving thought to the election, one thing that stands out in terms of partisanship this year is independents seem to be a lot less excited and interested and thinking about the election than they have in past election cycles. So when we ask just everyone in our poll, how much thought have you given to the upcoming election for president? 83% of Republicans say they've given a lot of thought. 81% of Democrats, basically the same, but only 64% of independents. Whereas at this time in 2008, it was up at 77% of independents. So we have seen this hyper-partisan environment dip, if you will, the interest and focus of independents in the race.
Yeah. And how does the interest in the election this time around compare to past presidential elections? And is that something that's correlated ultimately with turnout?
It tends to be correlated with turnout, as we've seen in past cycles. interest in the election is about the same. Enthusiasm for the election itself. So one question is, are you following the news on the election? Another question is, compared to previous elections, are you more enthusiastic or less or about the same? We did see a peak in that. 67% today say that they are more enthusiastic about this presidential election than others. Again, you do see that partisan split where the partisans tend to be more enthusiastic than others. Interestingly, for the Democrats, though, we see a high right now, 80% of Democrats saying that they are enthusiastic about this presidential election. Only 75% in comparison Republicans. But what's most interesting is when you compare that Democratic enthusiasm to previous cycles. So in 2008, for example, 68% of Democrats had that same level of enthusiasm. Today, that's up at 80%. So we do see a spike in Democrats, at least. But again, keep in mind the Republicans are right there with them. Independents are lagging behind at 54%, saying that they're more enthusiastic about this election than others.
Right. And so let's talk about the enthusiasm numbers in particular. I mean, what do we know about voter enthusiasm? Like you said, both in terms of voting, but also what is it more correlated with or not? What can we use it as a barometer for? Because it's something that Trump people point to a lot for the fact that he's outpacing Joe Biden.
It is. It's important to keep in mind, it's really easy to pick a trend from the past and say, this is what it's always meant. There are really big differences in this cycle. Number one is mail voting. We've seen more Americans vote at this point, at this date in this election than pretty much any election we've seen before.
Right.
So turnout has traditionally correlated with people's enthusiasm and interest and focus on the race. That being said, this election, it's really hard to just assume that that's going to be the case for those two reasons, the mail voting, but also because of this concern about fraud. We have seen the president address this issue in a very kind of unorthodox way. But whether or not the concern about the transparency of the vote becomes a real issue will certainly impact whether or not people are going to participate, how they're going to participate, whether they choose to vote by mail or try to vote in person. So I would caution against sort of making an apples to apples comparison just because the mode of voting this time is so different.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Fascinating stuff. You always do such a great job breaking it down for us, Mohamed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohamed.
Thanks for having us.
Next on Rising, the Trump campaign has a new and very interesting attack strategy against Joe Biden. We're going to talk about that when Rising continues.